When the Daleks were reintroduced into the new series of Doctor Who, they wanted the lights to flash in tandem with the speech as seamlessly as possible. Previously in the classic series, the operators themselves inside the Daleks were responsible for flashing the lights on the Daleks. The only problem with this is that, unfortunately, a lot of the time they were only pressing it to the speech they could hear, and sometimes this would inevitably be misaligned with the audio that was coming through, or if a Dalek operator wasn't quite sure what the Dalek dialogue was, sometimes they would press the lights for the incorrect audio. Stuff like this could happen in Power of the Daleks, for example, with the Dalek Supreme. So a solution was thought up, that the transmission that would send Nicholas Briggs's voice down through the ring modulator to do the Dalek voices would also send a signal to flash the Dalek lights at the same time. The only problem is the amplification that was used got interfered with by the device sending off the signal to make the Dalek Dome lights flash, which meant that the voice didn't sound correct. It sounded very high-pitched and also distorted. So, to do a quick solution, since, they were running on the clock, they basically had a guy stand with a device as far away as possible, and Nicholas Briggs would signal by pointing his finger down every time he spoke, which was a signal to the person holding the actual receiver to make the Dalek lights flash, so that every time he spoke, the Dalek lights would flash in tandem. This still wasn't perfect because, as I said, it's still being operated by an actual human being, and that having to listen, or in this case watch, when Nick Briggs is pointing downwards, which this apparently gave him a really sore wrist afterwards. So, it was quickly changed, though, to actually just have the transmitter option, just by having the transmitter be further away, and it just to be automatic, so whenever Nicholas Briggs spoke, the Dalek lights would flash in tandem with it perfectly. However, it wasn't until Asylum of the Daleks when finally this equipment was integrated into the same mixing desk, which would also put out Nicholas Briggs's Dalek voices. This would obviously make things much easier, since they could have everything in one desk, and it was much easier to carry around in that as well. Though something that has happened in more recent years is that the Dalek lines have been dubbed on a lot of the times afterwards, even though if Nick Briggs was there in person, a lot of the times they want a new clean feed and that to put on afterwards. This has resulted in incorrect dialogue being given to the incorrect Dalek. For example, in The Witch's Familiar / Magician's Apprentice, the Special Weapons Dalek actually had lines. Not many, but a couple, and Nicholas Briggs did do a special Dalek voice, which he had said previously at conventions and also on Dalek 6388's YouTube channel as well, but for some reason they weren't used, and just another random Dalek was attributed those lines to the Special Weapons Dalek, which meant that the voice one didn't fit and they didn't flash in tandem either. Now, this was hardly the first time Dalek voices had ever been dubbed on afterwards. For example, in Remembrance of the Daleks, almost all the Dalek voices were dubbed on afterwards, apart from in studio scenes. That's why the Supreme Dalek sounds so much more different when it's on location than it is when in the studio. But nevertheless, it is still odd that it is still happening today, even though Nick Briggs meticulously goes through each Dalek and gives them all distinguishing voices, even if it is just slightly high and slightly lower pitch, he always makes them all distinct from each other. But it is always interesting to know how they went about going to a solution to have the Dalek lights flash in tandem, to only go back on that idea a lot of the time and just having them dubbed over afterwards in post, meaning a lot of the time they don't automatically flash in tandem.